Welcome. Happy day after Christmas. I am Susie Terrell, Secretary of the La Center Historical Museum, where we are the memory keepers for La Center's history and try very hard to keep the museum displays true to that connection. We are open the first and third Saturday of every month from noon to 4 p.m. We'd love to be open more, but with only 6 volunteers, it's difficult to do. So if anyone out there would be interested in joining our group, we'd love to have you. You don't have to commit to a huge amount of time. You can help out just a few hours a month or even a few times a year. Answering questions seems to be the main worry that keeps folks from wanting to volunteer. But never fear, you're always paired with a board member who can usually answer them. You're mainly there to meet and greet folks and make them welcome. But just by being there, you'd be immersed in the history and learn by seeing and hearing about it. And speaking of history, a few months ago, the museum was contacted by Steve Becker, asking permission to use a photo from our webpage to include in a story he was writing. Well, I got really excited and wanted to hear more about it. So I'd like to now introduce our very special guest to read his amazing story, recounting his grandfather's role in the race to the river. Please welcome Mr. Steve Becker.
Thank you so much, Susie. And you know, thinking back, it's been over a year since my first contact with you. And what surprised me was how interested you were and how helpful you were. I thought for sure in order to borrow that picture, I was going to have to fill out paperwork but you made it so easy, and your support has been really, really valuable. I think in normal non-COVID times, I probably would have come to a board meeting or a meeting of the community in La Center and said, hey, I'll read the story to you. But thanks to Brad Richardson at the Clark County Historical Museum, we're able to use technology and help share this story in a much wider audience. My involvement in this story goes back to about 1968 when I was 10 years old. My grandfather came and picked us up, my mom and my 2 sisters, Terry and Karen, and my brother David. And he took us on a drive to a place called View, Washington, north of Vancouver, north of Battle Ground. And it's a place where he spent some of his growing up years. And during that trip, he told me about an event where a woman had had a baby. She was hemorrhaging badly, and they were asked to literally carry this woman to the ferry at La Center. It was a very dramatic story. Later, when I was working as a reporter for a radio station in Seattle, I had a very high quality professional tape recorder, and my wife Chris and I traveled to Arizona to interview, really to record some of these stories. Last year, I was converting those cassettes to digital format so they could be saved permanently. And I found details about that rescue at View that day. Given COVID and the fact that this rescue of Laura South and her daughter happened during the Great Flu epidemic of 1918, it just felt like this story had taken on a whole new level of importance and value. So with that, race down the river, down the mountain to the river, to find what is left of the verdant, frequently soggy, but mostly forgotten community of Mountain View, or simply View, Washington. Travel north and keep going. Past Battle Ground, the highway devolves into a series of interconnected roads, cutting through dense woods and open pastures, narrowing and winding, rising and falling like a roller coaster, until nearly in the shadow of Mount St. Helens stands a tall, white, clapboard church on a hill, surrounded by a cemetery and generations of headstones. Here are the markers for those who settled this far northern edge of Clark County. They lived out their lives as farmers, lumberjacks, mill workers, shopkeepers, and their wives and children. It is, as the name suggests, a place with a commanding view of Mount St. Helens, the top of Mount Adams, and on a clear day, Mount Hood and a bit of Mount Jefferson far to the south in Oregon. One sun-bleached headstone in the View Cemetery marks the resting place for Laura South and her newborn daughter. What it does not record is the dramatic steps many members of this once bustling community took in the spring of 1918 to save this woman and her child. At age 14, my grandfather, Floyd Leland Pittard, an orphan earning his keep with the family of Francis Reed, was one of those called to drop his chores and help with an urgent rescue. Born April 12, 1904 in Rochester, New York, my grandfather knew family turmoil early on. When domestic violence left her no choice but to divorce her abusive husband, Iva Pittard broke a dinner plate across his face when he tried to grab their son and prevent her from leaving their home in a boarding house. Without a job or a place to live, the young mother placed Floyd temporarily in an orphanage. He would plead tearfully during her weekly visits to return home while cradling the apple or orange she brought as a gift. Iva eventually found work in the film winding room of the Eastman Kodak factory in Rochester, and later a small apartment across the street above a corner grocery store. While Floyd would remember the sweet fragrance of bananas wafting up from the grocer below, his mother faced much more daunting challenges in the workplace. Injuries were common in the film winding room. The most gruesome happened to women with long hair that became entangled in the winding mechanisms. Workplace hazards had to be on Iva's mind when her father, John Deacon, suggested she relocate to Portland, Oregon. He needed her help managing 3 small restaurants he was operating in various locations near the city center. Shortly after Christmas in 1910, Floyd and his mother boarded a train bound for the Rose City. They were compelled to sit by the conductor for most of the trip after Iva nearly set the train on fire while trying to prepare hot water for tea. Living in a basement apartment near 12th and Alder in downtown Portland was a big change from the industrial neighborhood they had known in Rochester. Floyd was home from school one day for lunch when the rapid clanging of a horse-drawn fire engine drew his attention. He and a classmate ran to the curb to investigate the commotion, only to have the classmate step too far out into the street, where he was struck and immediately killed by the passing fire engine. Grandfather would later describe the intense trauma of watching his young friend perish. Portland was also the place where at age 6, Floyd began his working life hawking newspapers on a downtown street corner. Later, as a young adult working as a telegraph operator for the Postal Telegraph Company in Sacramento, California, my grandfather described a message coming out over the wire in a series of dots and dashes that reported a man named Lindbergh had made a nonstop crossing of the Atlantic Ocean in an airplane. To Floyd, it was a stunning accomplishment. It was also in Portland that a well-dressed, charming man Floyd described as handsome would enter their lives, putting Floyd and Iva on a path to the remote community of View. Archie Urey had come from Davenport, Iowa, and worked as a stationary engineer at an ice and coal plant on the banks of the Willamette River. Floyd was filled with awe as he toured the plant and the row upon rows of ducks and fish hanging in cold storage. Archie was an inventor working on improvements to steam engines and wanted more space to perfect his latest innovations. A cousin living at View offered use of his 40 acres as a testing and development site. At some point, Iva and Archie were married, loaded young Floyd and their belongings onto a covered wagon, and made the long journey across the Columbia River. As a stationary steam engineer, Archie must have found work with one of the many timber companies working in and around View. They depended on experienced engineers to manage the sled-mounted steam-powered winch or donkey engines to move cut logs up the mountain to a flume used to float logs west of the Lewis River at the town of La Center. But activity did not always equal prosperity. Archie and Iva found a cramped, thin-walled house. When he was not at school, Floyd had to make sure the wood bin was always full, the chickens fed, and the cow milked. By 1914, Iva was expecting a child in the spring of the following year. Neither she nor her child would live to see the summer of 1915. Floyd loved to brush his mother's hair. It was a ritual they shared, and he had been brushing her hair when a neighbor woman arrived to see Iva, and he was sent outside. At some point, Floyd came running into the house as Archie pleaded with him to run as fast as he could to the Bradley family down the road to use their telephone to call for the doctor in La Center. Lifeless on the floor and covered in blood, it was too late. Iva Yuri and her unborn child died June 13th, 1915. Her passing was the source of great family speculation, but Iva's death certificate lists multiple causes, including preeclampsia, a dangerous elevation of her blood pressure. Within a few weeks, Floyd's stepfather would leave him a $5 bill and depart on a trip to Davenport, Iowa, where he planned to acquire supplies for his inventions. Archie never returned. At age 11, Floyd Pittard was now an orphan, valued only as a source of labor. Neighbors Orrin Grantham and his wife were the first to take him in. They were newlyweds, living in a tar paper house on land being cleared of tree stumps for farming. Their agreement with Floyd covered room and board in exchange for getting the wood stove in the kitchen fired each morning, keeping the house stocked with firewood and kindling, milking cows and feeding hogs. Early morning starts in a drafty house were especially hard in winter, as cold seeped into the improvised home like an icy thief. It was a time when Floyd came to know just how desolate life could be. The Grantham's home was thrown into disarray one morning when it was discovered Mrs. Grantham left with the family purse and was seeking a divorce. It was a marital calamity that opened the door to a period of stability and acceptance for Floyd when a neighbor, Francis Reed, arrived at the Grantham farm on horseback with another horse in tow. Reed told Floyd the animal was his to care for if he would move in with the Reed family. It was a generous offer, and the young boy quickly packed his mother's trunk, loaded it onto a wheeled cart, and walked to the Reed family farm at Farger Lake. The horse, I'm told, was quick to establish who was boss, and Floyd was welcome into the Reed home as a family member. Specifically, Reed, in his mid-20s, and his wife insisted the boy attend school and take part in family activities. It marked the beginning of a period of happiness, relative prosperity, and growth at View. Food production and its related tasks were an all-consuming pursuit. Floyd was allocated a 1/16th share of Francis Reed's 100-acre share of a 200-acre farm. When he wasn't cultivating and selling potatoes, haying, or butchering a hog, he would wander down to the creek and catch crayfish. When he was not working, the rough and tumble logging town offered other diversions. Clark County enacted prohibition on alcohol in 1910, but taverns were still allowed in the towns of La Center and Yacolt. Alcohol was not allowed at the Reed household, but Watkins flavorings could be found in the kitchen and were a potent substitute. Community attitudes about alcohol did not extend to the lumberjacks and mill workers who would gather Friday night and frequently celebrate in excess. It was enough of an event that young boys would gather to watch fights spill out into the street. "He bit my ear off," Floyd once heard a man exclaim while tromping through the muddy street, searching for his missing lobe. Muddy, nearly impassable roads were a constant problem. During winter and spring months, when rain would fall for days on end and in relentless waves, the narrow roads leading into View were rarely suitable for horse-pulled carts and wagons. They were very frequently impassable. John Deacon once made the long journey from Portland to visit his grandson. He was appalled at the poor condition of the roads. It was so bad that even his horse and buggy became mired in the thick mountain muck. Even when the road into View was passable, it was still a bumpy, irregular, bone-jarring surface. This weakness in the transportation network and the persistent rain would set the terms of a life and death struggle for Laura South and her daughter. The race to save mother and daughter would be nothing less than a race down the mountain. It began late in the afternoon, Saturday, March 30th, 1918, when the bell that normally called children to school each day began ringing with rapid, clanging urgency. Town people came running. Laura South was desperate. She was a new mother and hemorrhaging badly. Her survival depended on getting to a hospital in Portland. Even if an ambulance could make its way from La Center or Vancouver, Mrs. South would never survive the jolting, rattling ride down one mountainous hillside and up another. Their only choice, Their only option was to carry her in an improvised bed to Timmins Landing in Le Center, where she would be put on the ferry to Portland. The plan was as simple as it was backbreaking. A folding bed assembled with long, thick poles tied under both ends of the frame, allowing a rotating crew of 8 men, 4 at the head of the bed and 4 at the feet, to carry her almost 10 miles to the Le Center ferry dock. A covered wagon carried Laura South's infant daughter and copious amounts of food for those carrying the cobbled together bed. The procession would stop periodically to allow Mrs. South to nurse her child and for men to switch out with those who were rested. It was difficult from the start. As night fell, it got harder. Cold spring rains filled the boots of the men carrying Mrs. South, and mud caked their damp clothing. One person would slip on the rutted road surface, forcing the others to brace hard to prevent the bed from touching the ground. Laura South's face was very red, and she was clearly very sick, but she never complained about the bumpy, uneven ride. At one point during the walk through the night, as oil lanterns on the wagon feebly lit the road ahead, one of the men carrying Mrs. South dropped to the ground, gripped with a grand mal seizure, bringing the column to a stop. Some wondered if they would soon be carrying a second patient. When another volunteer tried to revive the seizure victim with water from a mud puddle, the seizure patient loudly instructed the helper to keep that dirty water away from me. After the seizure passed, he rode in the wagon with the infant. Just before daylight, it became clear delays along the way meant they would miss the ferry, and with it, any chance of survival for the mother and daughter. At the flat above Le Center, a single rider on horseback rode ahead to a farm to call the Le Center terminal and arrange a delayed departure of the ferry. When Laura South was finally and gently lowered onto the deck of the idling steamboat, each of the mud-streaked men who had walked her through the night removed their sweat-streaked hats and bid her farewell. In gratitude for their selfless dedication, the family took the 20 or so men and women who had carried Mr. South or supported the caravan in some way out to breakfast at a restaurant in Le Center. When he saw the menu included what he understood to be California strawberries, Floyd Pittard quickly submitted his order, only to be shocked and painfully disappointed when the waiter brought out a steaming plate full of kidney beans. The restaurant management apparently thought that was a pretty funny joke in 1918. The exhausted glee that people felt as the ferry carrying Mrs. South chugged off to Portland would not last. Within days, word reached Floyd that Mrs. South had died in the hospital in Portland and that her daughter passed away several days later. Mother and child were buried next to each other with separate headstones, which are still visible near the west side of the church at the View Cemetery. People went on with their lives. Floyd Pittard soon found work at the 7-mile-long log flume that floated logs from View down to the Lewis River at Le Center. After failing to free a snag that caused a massive logjam, he was fired, but quickly landed new work in the logging camp itself. It was here he witnessed a steam engine explosion that sliced a man in half, a scene so horrific, so gruesome, he knew it was time to find work outside View. Floyd made his way to Portland, traveled with a friend on the steamship Beaver to San Francisco, and eventually found work in a Long Beach, California shipyard. Life on the waterfront led to a stint on the Chillicothe, one of the last commercial sailing ships to ply the waters of the Pacific Ocean between California, Australia, Japan, and Seattle. Later in life, he became an executive of Pacific Northwest Bell Telephone Company, and he retired in Portland in 1966. He passed away in Tempe, Arizona in 1993. His headstone can be found at the View Cemetery next to his mother Iva's and a short distance from that of Laura South and her daughter. Other reminders of the early settlers of View include Reed Road and Grantham Road, which are both near the present-day Mountain View Cemetery. So with that, there's a slight delay on Facebook. I'd be happy to take your questions or share comments you might have about Le Center or the View Cemetery. So in the chat function on Facebook, you can submit your questions or make a brief comment. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I would like to thank Susie Terrell and the Le Center Historical Museum for making this program possible. I really want to thank Brad Richardson, the Executive Director of the Clark County Historical Museum. Susie and I came up with this idea, and Brad was the one who provided the technology that made it all possible. So thank you, Susie and Brad and the museum. We also used one picture from the University of Washington Library. The picture of the donkey steam engine is probably more in the Seattle area. So also, if you're interested in having your own copy of this story, it's available in the Clark County History 2020. This just came out in November, and copies are available for purchase at the Clark County Historical Museum. So again, we are here to take your questions. And with that, I would end the screen share and come back to you. And Susie, hand it back to you. Susie's gonna join us here in just a second, and we're gonna take some questions if there are any. It's been a pleasure working on this project, and I have so appreciated the support. I also want to point out that Floyd Leland Pitter's daughter is with us on this call. Regine Mack is actually my mother, and she's with us on Zoom. In fact, she's really the primary Zoom user in our household. So I grew up, my mom sharing this story with us, and I vividly remember that day that my grandfather took our family up to View to share this story. Go ahead. You know, there's the question is, how did they float logs from View to Le Center? And, you know, there's a great picture. If you search on the internet, the Le Center Historical Museum, the museum actually has pictures of parts of a flume. And it's a device that's built. It's really a channel. They pumped water up to View, and they built this flume, and they literally would float logs down this very extensive network down to Le Center, where the logs were hauled to the Columbia River, and then they were probably milled in Vancouver or Portland. But there, I believe, and others can correct me if I don't have this right, but at one time there were 6 or 7 different flumes that were used to float logs from View down to Le Center. There was a considerable amount of logging activity that went on at View during the First World War. And from the research that I did for this story, a lot of it had to do with the United States, when it became involved in the First World War in Europe, had to rebuild the rail network. And in order to do that, they needed railroad ties. So many of the railroad ties that were hauled to Europe were originally from trees that were cut down at View, floated to Le Center, converted into railroad ties, and then shipped to Europe. Other questions? Jane, thank you so much, Jane, for being with us. Jane's actually in Southern California. Thank you. So Jane, if you look, View might not even be on a map. There's a few people who live there today. It is an unincorporated area of Clark County. So if you look on a map and you find Le Center, and then you go to the east and find Battleground, if you drew a line if you could imagine Le Center on the west and Battleground on the south, if you let those two lines converge, that's going to be about where View is. A beautiful, beautiful community that was once very, very, very busy. And I also think one of the things that was fascinating to me was my grandfather described that horrific, the muddy path that passed as a road. And it did point to that as highways and roads were built, it put the Le Center ferry out of business. Once there were paved roads leading to those remote corners of Clark County, there was no longer a need for the ferry. Great, thank you. And go ahead, Brad. From what the research that I have done and what I could discern was to get into view, it was a rutted path, and you had to have a wagon. If you think back to 1918, there were very, very few cars or trucks that were available at that time. So they were still horse-drawn wagons. My grandfather described moving from Portland, from 12th and Alder, and he vividly recalled the day that Archie, his stepfather, had, is it called a Calistoga wagon? You know, the old covered wagon, pulled up to the apartment they were living in, and they loaded their possessions. And that wagon was pulled through Portland to the ferry at Vancouver. They crossed at Vancouver at that point and then went north. So there were rutted paths. And these were logging camps, most of those remote areas. And as the trees came down, people would clear the stumps and convert that into pastures for farming. And as roads started to come along in the latter part of around the 1920s and 1930s, it became much easier to access those parts of Clark County. So again, I want to thank everybody who made this possible. Brad Richardson from the Clark County Historical Museum, and Susie Terrell, thank you so much. And if I could do anything, I'd make a pitch both for the LeCentre Museum and for the Clark County Historical Museum. They are preserving our stories that I think are so very, very important. One of the things that struck me about this, not just in the time of COVID, but in a time when there's just so much political division in our country, what struck me about the story about 1918, nobody cared about their Facebook status. Nobody cared what their likes or dislikes were. One of their neighbors was in desperate need of help, and that's all that mattered. They rang the bell at the school vigorously. It was clearly an emergency, and people dropped what they were doing to help this woman get to healthcare, to safety. The way that my grandfather described, they knew she was very, very sick, and that it was a risky proposition, but they were going to do their best. So I take inspiration from that today. That I think our ancestors are kind of showing us the way, that to relate to our neighbors, not as a social media contact, but as the people with whom we survive, and we depend on each other to survive. So I think that's the other lesson that I got from this story. And it also happened at a time of a global pandemic. So there's an important lesson there to learn. But please support our museums. Brad and Susie have done so much. And I think this program is an example of the way that we're using technology to help some of these very, very important stories. When I talked to Scott Hewitt at the Columbian, and thank you, Scott, for your interest in our story, we were talking about family histories and family stories and how do you do this? I started talking to my grandfather with a tape recorder, but it's very, very easy to talk to our grandparents and our parents about what their experiences were simply by asking the question, what was your earliest memory? And I remember asking my grandfather, his earliest memory was that fragrance of bananas, living in that apartment in Rochester. And then the next question is, and then what do you remember? And then what happened? I really think it's so important that we record these stories. Go ahead, Brad. Doug, a great question, and thank you for being part of our program today. And that's, what I had understood was that the doctor was in LeCentre. The closest healthcare was in LeCentre. And when my great-grandmother collapsed, that was what my grandfather was told. We've got to get the doctor from LeCentre to come up. And given the very, very terrible quality of the roads, that was it was an iffy proposition. Just in some of the research that I've done in my own, I have a serious addiction to Ancestry.com. And one of the things that I've noticed that is shocking to me is the number of women who in the late 1800s and early 1900s and even into the 1940s who died in childbirth. Both my great-grandmother, Iva Uri, and Laura South died in childbirth. To live in a remote community like View for a woman about to deliver a child was a very, very risky proposition.
Steve, I want to thank you so much for not only for your story, but your interest in interviewing your grandfather and taking on that role to record his history. I've done several interviews with elders around the center, and you're right. If you just start asking a question or two, they usually run with it. They love to talk, and I have some interviews that are 4 and 5 hours long, and it's great history, and I love hearing about it. But I so appreciate you taking the time, and it just shows the love that you had for your grandfather and for recording this. And I am an amateur genealogist, so it really is important to me. And I love hearing the history of La Center. We moved up here in 2014 from Wilsonville, Oregon, and it was just before Christmas. And the very first time the museum was open after New Year's, I went down to check it out, see what it was all about. And I was amazed I mean, it's a small house, but it is packed full of information. And the people that were there just immediately won me over. I always tease them that they threw a ball and chain around my ankle and said, "Oh, you've got to join us." And I promise not to do that to people because I think that that story scares them off a bit. But I think for the most part, people are worried about answering questions they don't know the answers to. Well, I was brand new to La Center, and I didn't know anything about anything. But while you're there, it's not like you get bombarded with visitors and you don't have a chance to read and look around. But while you're there, you really just get immersed in its history. And there's a lot of crazy things that have happened in this little town, and a lot of fun and heartbreaking. But I love showing it off and telling folks about it. And I can't wait until the governor gives us the okay to get back open, because last year we had several events ready to hit the road in March and we were shut down. And so those events are on hold for right now, but we're hoping come spring we'll be able to open them back up. Because this little town really is supportive. Like when we had a Veterans Appreciation Day, and we had over 70 to maybe 85 people come and join us, and it was just a great event, and we missed doing that this last November. So anyway, I want to let you know that we're ready to go as soon as we get the okay, and we'd love to have you folks join us. Come on in and actually learn about your history here.
It's here. And Susie, before we go, and I know we're going to start moving on to other business here soon, but before we go, I know that Floyd Pittard's daughter is with us, and that's my mother, Regine Mack. And I don't, if we can unmute her for just a second. And Mom, I'm just wondering, any other thoughts? I know when I was growing up, we would go up to visit the Hazen Chapel at View, which is what it's called. And I remember my mom playing the piano there. And I believe there is still an active church presence, but let's just see if Regine Mack, if she's unmuted. And Mom, what are your recollections about this place?
I have been going to View since I was just a little girl. We went every year to put flowers on my grandmother's grave, and we planted a tree, and we really did a grave cleaning for many, many years until the cemetery district, I think it's number 4, was created, and now the View Cemetery is very well taken care of. My memory of going there was hearing this story many times of the Souths. And the chapel there is called the Hazen Chapel, and I believe that's a family that is still in view. Am I right, Steve?
I believe,
believe-
yes.
I believe
They're
that's correct.
one of
Yes.
the early families, and yes, you're right.
Yes. And I early on would go into the chapel, and I think they had a little pump organ, and I would play hymns.
Yeah.
And I was very disappointed when it was necessary to have the church locked, because that was one of my favorite memories, was to be able to go in and sit down in a little church with nobody but my father there, and he'd listen to me play. So the chapel, the View Cemetery are very important in my life. I have, that's where I will be eventually.
Yep.
And I have a mother and a father and a grandmother and a daughter. And I'll have more of my family with me even after I'm gone. So it's a special place for me. And when you think about View, just think of that Hazen Chapel sitting on top of that hill and looking out at the mountains.
Thank you, Mom. That is Floyd Pittard's daughter, my mom. And Susie Terrell, I'm going to sign off and say thank you so much for this opportunity to share this story. Thank you for helping preserve the stories of Le Center. Brad Richardson from the Clark County Historical Museum, thank you for making this presentation possible. Have a great evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve.